Welcome to the Social Change Diaries, the show that looks behind the curtain at everything you want to know about the social justice and nonprofit landscape. I'm your host, Vanessa Wakeman. On today's episode of the Social Change Diaries, I am chatting with Abigail Disney. I met Abigail several years ago at a screening of her film, Pray the Devil Back to Hell. For me, that film felt like a prequel to Beyonce's Formation. Seeing women come together to use nonviolent protests to end Liberia's civil war was so inspiring. And I remember looking across the room and seeing basically the entire audience in tears, and the energy in the room shifted and people were fired up and talking about, why it's important for women to work together and to sort of come forward and use their voices. And so it definitely was a beautiful moment of women sort of feeling that they had permission to own their thought leadership and their thinking. And so I'm really excited to interview Abigail today. Abigail is an Emmy Award-winning director and producer, philanthropist, and the CEO and president of Fork Films and founder of the nonprofit Peace is Loud. So I am lucky to have the Emmy Award-winning Abigail Disney with me today on the Social Change Diaries. Abigail, thank you so much for joining me.
I'm so glad to be here.
Thank you. So what I was hoping to do over this course of, this is our first season of the podcast, and the theme, as you know, is women in thought leadership. And so I've been having great conversations with women who are in the nonprofit sector, women who are supporting women in the nonprofit sector. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk with you is because your films really focus on a number of issues related to women. And I just think you have an interesting perspective because your work has not only been national, it's been international, global. And so just trying to see what the themes are around how women use their voices. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, do you find any challenges in telling the stories that you relay? So in our work with thought leaders, particularly women, we sometimes find that they are doubtful of the value of their contributions. They're hesitant to raise their voice. What have you seen, I guess, on a global perspective around women and how they're using their voices?
Yeah, well, I can come at that about a million ways because there are so many spoken and unspoken barriers. When we made the first film that we made, Pray the Devil Back to Hell, the barrier was that nobody acknowledged the value of what the women had done. And so there was nothing in print or in any kind of recorded memory of what they had done. So we had to go back and reconstruct that story, kind of out of thin air. And there was very little material in terms of archival footage and stuff like that. That's a massive barrier, and it makes it incredibly difficult to tell women's stories. And this happens over and over and over again. It's easier now to find footage than it used to be just because there are people with cell phones around and you can find footage that way. But nevertheless, this is something we've seen over and over and over again, is that it's not that they're written out of history, it's that they're never written in, right? Because there's such a tendency to disregard what they do and what they contribute. And for me personally, it was always very hard from the very start to have enough faith in my judgment and what I was seeing, especially because nobody else was seeing the value of it. So I kept, every once in a while you think to yourself, well, then there must not be value. I must be the crazy one. So you do have to kind of force yourself forward in spite of a lot of doubt. And when I made Armor of Light in particular, I couldn't understand why nobody else had really thought to ask pro-life people about what was consistent about their gun position. And because no one had done it before, I kept thinking maybe there was something about it that I wasn't understanding, some kind of error in judgment or logic.
That's a great point that you make about sort of doubting what you're seeing. And I find that a lot with women thought leaders. We are doubting, is it just us? If no one else is seeing this, are we crazy? Instead of looking at it as, wow, I am ahead of my time, or I'm just more analytical in this way, or I see a different perspective in this way.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And that's, I had to say to myself, that's what artists do.
Yes.
They think of stuff, or think about stuff in a way that has never been thought before. So this is the challenge, is having the courage to go forward anyway. And then I don't know, it must be a socialized thing that they kind of are born thinking every thought they have is really so special and precious. So they don't have quite the headwinds that we have when we do it. But that's the idea, is you have to go into dangerous territory.
Another point that you made, which I want to just expand on for a minute, is that women weren't written out of history. We just, were never written in. I wonder, and I don't have the answer to this, but, when you said it, it just came to my mind. I wonder if that also lends itself to the reasons why, when we are contributing to an issue, we have no expectation around how we are going to be positioned. And so when we're working with men, I've had more than one man sort of come to me and basically say, hey, make me famous. Whereas women, oftentimes it's, head down, quiet, doing the work. And I wonder if, just without us realizing, because we don't see enough models of the positioning of a thought leader, of sort of being the main person bringing it forward in a more strategic way, that we don't even consider that as an option for us. So I guess that's part of the the role and the importance of the work you're doing, is creating those stories and that history and those archives so that future generations do have those opportunities.
Right. I mean, I've seen it so many times where, we go to make a film about a group of women and it never occurred to them that they were worthy of such a thing. So I do think that women are socialized to humility a lot more than men. And sometimes I think it's not that we should be more like them, they should be more like us. Some humility would be great in certain men. So I don't think it's all men. I think plenty of men are humble, and all I've done in my life is just to try to keep my head down, as you say, and do the work. Attention comes if attention comes, but the kind of attention you get because you sought it out isn't really very satisfying.
Now, tell me a little bit about your nonprofit, Peace Out Loud. You work with local leaders. Tell me a little bit about what led you to start the organization and what you're doing. Sure.
It's called Peace is Loud. I like things that are sentences. And we started it really right after Pray the Devil Back to Hell came out, and there was just this clamoring for us to bring the film to different places and show it, and then have a series of conversations about what the women did in Liberia and how that was maybe applicable, could be learned from in lots of other contexts, Peru and Cambodia and Georgia and so forth. So what I was seeing was that there were so many places I was going where they were hungry to build peace movements, but they didn't have the resources. They couldn't get the attention, and they just would sort of stop at first base instead of going on because they'd run out of resources or whatever. So we want to lift the profiles of people who are, especially women who are fighting for peace, who are really going out on a limb. I mean, it's a dangerous job to fight for peace, ironically enough. And you really take a lot of risks, and you need your profile raised. It makes you safer, it makes you stronger, it gives you more to work with in terms of currency. So we have a public speakers bureau, because there were a lot of women who weren't getting compensated for their speaking, and that makes me crazy angry. So we make sure they're compensated and treated appropriately. And we have screenings and other live events where we gather people and we talk about peace and various things. And we have a website, and we have some public education, and we do screening campaigns for other films.
That's fantastic. And tell me, are there specific women's issues that you are interested, that when you're thinking about how Peace is Loud is going to interact with certain groups, or the next film that you're going to work on, are there sort of like the 5, passion topics for you that you're always looking at, or is it just things as they evolve in the public sphere? Like, how do you sort of pick your focus?
Well, I think that, like, if you want to talk about women's lives in a way that helps them, peace is an incredibly important framework to bring to it, because, when you're talking about peace, you're not just talking about ending a war, a formal war. The kind of conflict that women deal with every day in their lives and have to troubleshoot, not only for themselves but for their families, it materially undermines their ability to move forward in their lives and be the powerful people they have the capacity to be. So, sexual violence and sexual harassment, domestic violence, crime, rape, at least all the things that affect women disproportionately interfere with what might be called peace. And so I like to kind of gather it all under that framework, because it's a mistake to think that if we don't have a formal war on our own shores that we're a country at peace. We're not. We are deeply enmeshed in the language and currency of violence, and we need to extricate ourselves from that and imagine that the world, in fact, doesn't need to be the way that it is. So I like to put it in terms of peace because I want to make sure everybody understands that peace is something you can construct, and it benefits everybody.
I'm sorry, I need a moment with that one. That was a fantastic answer. In thinking about this construct of peace, what role do you think film plays in social change? So you have a wonderful gift in figuring out how to tell stories in a way that are really moving. When I first saw Pray the Devil Back to Hell, it sort of like stuck with me. I remember talking about it all evening and the next day and still having conversations about it. So, which I guess is the goal of a filmmaker. You want people to feel led to, some type of action. What do you think is the role of film in social change?
I mean, I used to, I started as a philanthropist and a grant maker. I used to be very cynical about film because it felt like, it wasn't direct enough. The benefit of it was too intangible. But now that I'm doing what I'm doing, I realize that all those years I spent in grant making before were like nothing compared to the kind of change that we've seen as a result of the films that we've made. Because, films climb into your heart. You were just talking about the way Prey affected you for days and days, and films stay with you in a way that just talking to someone cannot possibly. So, or reading a book even, unless it's a very special book, it doesn't really stay with you. There's something about sitting there in the dark, and losing yourself in that story that really alters the shape of your insides and makes you receptive to the ideas that other people matter and that their realities are different, but that their spirits are the same and all that kind of thing. So first of all, film has a very unique way of connecting other people to each other and connecting people to a message. And then, it is portable in a way that other things aren't. And the fact is you can send a link or send a DVD anywhere in the world, and it is understood. As long as you can get over a language barrier, that film will speak to anybody anywhere, regardless if it's about African women and you're showing it in Eastern Europe, or if it's about Eastern European women and you're showing it in Afghanistan. People understand each other in a film. Film is like a universal language. And so it has this amazing ability to sort of flatten the world and make it possible to really reach very wide with a message.
I personally think it's brilliant to have a film company that focuses solely on women's issues. And I also think that it's disruptive and innovative, two qualities that I think are really important to thought leadership. And so I'd love to know, how do you see your thought leadership? Like, how would you define your thought leadership?
Well, that's a big phrase. That's a little scary to me, thought leadership, but that's very female of me to even be intimidated by it. I try to bring a fresh analysis to things. I get really tired of the sort of comfortable and worn out phrasing and ways of thinking of things. So I think it's always really important to bring something new and something surprising in the way that I think about things. So for instance, surprising advocates are really, really important, which is why I went looking for somebody in the pro-life community to talk about the problem of gun laws, because you would never expect that because of the way things align. But if you really stop and take a step back and look at it rationally, there's nothing conservative about gun policy. It's radical and it's socially destabilizing. So I sometimes think that the best thought leadership stops the conversation where it is and then really unpacks everything and looks at it absent the lenses that we kind of forget we're wearing, but, looks at it really rationally and from a higher point of view, a morals and values-based point of view. And that's what I try to bring to everything that I do.
So then I have a question in response to your response. If your films are educating us as viewers and sort of prompting us to a call to action, I'm curious, how does the filmmaker still wear the thought leader hat while allowing other people to tell the story. So this is an issue that you're interested in under the framework of trying to raise awareness for these topics, but you have no control over where the story goes. And as the filmmaker, you are in many ways behind the scenes and putting other people in the forefront. And so that's a little different than the traditional model of thought leadership. So does that, and I know you're not doing your work thinking about it through the lens of thought leadership, but I'm just curious, how does that impact how you're serving as a champion for these issues? So you don't know what the pro-lifer is the story that they're going to tell. Are you walking into these stories with any particular agendas?
Yes, absolutely. I am. And the thing is that, like, it may seem like as a documentary filmmaker, you just roll the camera and whatever happens, happens. But that's true until you get to the edit room. And when you get to the edit room, you have all kinds of power. And that's why sometimes people are very reluctant to work with documentary filmmakers, because they understand the editor gets the last word. And so that's where you really shape your message. And you have total power over that. And so documentaries, while they may rest on the actions and the commentary of other people, because you're able to shape them, you're more like a painter. So it's not like you're writing an essay just explaining the way you think. You're using the emotional reactions that people have to other people to shape people and guide them to a certain set of ideas and beliefs. I mean, it's not as articulate as writing, and I'm a writer. I like to think of the world and argue about things, but this is a very different form of communication. This is the language of the heart. And if you can tell a story well, you can really guide people to the place that you're hoping to get them. And so when I went into every film I've ever made, I've had a place I've wanted people to go.
As a side note, I feel like in each of these interviews, there's this one standout quote that I get from each guest that I will forever remember. And I think for you, yours is stories are the language of the heart. Like, I think that's so beautiful and so very true. So thank you for that.
Okay.
What do you think needs to happen for more women to use their voices to create change?
Well, I think partly we're seeing it right now with this cavalcade of stories about Harvey Weinstein and people like this. That's starting to happen. So women need to see other women come off the sidelines before they'll do it, for the most part. So we need more of those brave people who will step out first, because we're, I think, really at a tipping point here where women are just simply not going to sit back anymore and let things happen. So we need women to feel invited into the public square. Women do not come out of the womb thinking of themselves as good potential leaders and politicians and public figures. So they tend to want to feel invited to it. And so we need to figure out how to get them feeling invited. And the films I make are definitely geared toward making women feel invited and making them feel that it is actually possible to be an effective leader in your context. So we need to see more of each other and more of ourselves out there in the public. And so more and more, I think women are making films, women are speaking publicly, women are making podcasts like you. The more that we do this, the more that we'll see it, and the more that we'll get what we were looking for.
So in the U.S., there's been a number of conversations for a number of years about the lack of intergenerational collaboration on issues, or whether it be in the workplace, on, community building, movement building, et cetera. I recently interviewed Anna Oliveira, the CEO of the of New York Women's Foundation, and she talks about their concept of radical generosity and the importance of women helping women. And I remember in Pray the Devil Back to Hell, it was really moving to see women, from different age groups working together. How do you think women can work intergenerationally to advance causes? Because I don't feel like we see enough of that here.
Well, I think that goes back to the question of visibility. I think there is more of it than you see. Because I think as long as I've been working in the women's movement, I've seen so much mentoring and just really women consciously saying it's important for me to mentor professional women in the corporate world, and women in the not-for-profit world, and women in the political world. If you go and talk to the women in the Congress right now, there is an enormous amount of cross-generational work and mentoring going on there. So I think that there is more of it than we think there is. But yeah, we should raise the visibility of that work. And then there's, there's the inherent tension between generations that has always existed in the women's movement. And I think it's just because of the way society is structured. And that is that young women like to have a very different idea about things than their mothers. It's just the nature of things. And because we're feminists and we're women working with women, the older generation of women are very often too reminiscent of their own mothers for young women to want to work with. I mean, that's been my experience. So I think that we're always going to have a little bit of a struggle between the young ones and the old ones. That's just going to be hardwired into it. And every generation is going to rise and bring its challenges for the older generation. But I love it. They keep us honest and they keep us paying attention. And my daughters just will not just let me, take anything for granted. So, I think it's actually very helpful. I think that older women need to calm down and not be sensitive or feel too disrespected by the fact that the young ones have a different set of ideas. I think we should be listening and helping them lead.
That's great advice. If you sort of had the luxury of all the time in the world and, access to resources to help you, what issues or what emerging issues do you think are important to explore for an upcoming film project? If you could do multiple projects for 2018, what issues would you focus on?
Well, I'm very interested in the question of violence and militarism, and not just for their own sakes, but because they are, the core of what hold women back, in society. At the end of the day, the only difference between men and women is that they're stronger than we are, which is why we tend to have to build peace in our lives, right? Because we can't resolve conflicts generally with physical violence. So we need to develop other mechanisms, other means. But, as long as it comes back to if I'm alone in a hotel room with Harvey Weinstein and, he can do what he wants to me, until we move to a place in the world where physical violence is as repellent and as disgusting and as embarrassing as, as incest or as any of these kind of deeply troubling kinds of crimes, then women really will always function at a disadvantage. So, I want to kind of get Americans to understand how they have come to believe a narrative about violence, that it's natural to us, that it's normal, that it's inevitable, that it always happens. If I could have a magic wand and change anything about my country, I would uncouple the idea of violence and inevitability. I would get people to suddenly to start asking themselves, well, wait, does it necessarily have to go this way? Is there a better way to solve this problem? Because women won't attain full equality until we take violence out of the equation.
That is very true. In your various film projects, you've gone all over the world and met with women, from different parts of the world. Are there any commonalities you see among those that do decide to, take a leadership role in creating change or, elevating their voices or sort of standing up against oppression? Are there any sort of, three underlying traits that you found they all seem to have this?
When I first started working internationally, the first thing I saw was commonalities. It was actually striking and a little bit gobsmacked me because I couldn't get over how similar women were from place to place, even though they'd never really met each other or talked to each other. And I took that as a sign that, there's a really interesting movement here that's not just physical or social, that there's some kind of important well or zeitgeist that we've tapped into that we need to pay attention to. So those similarities are very important to me. And what I see in women leaders around the world is, first of all, they tend to be women who are less inhibited by fear. So they tend to pay attention less to those questions that we were talking about earlier, the things that hold us back, the hesitancies about our own thinking and ideas. They all have a sense of humor. This is true universally of women who lead. They tend to use the sense of humor as a way to coalesce people and bring groups together and keep them together. They tend to think in a way that's creative and different, wholly different. They like to imagine the world as if they mattered, to paraphrase Gloria Steinem. And they do always women leaders pay very much attention to the younger women behind them. They always place a very high priority on nurturing the leadership coming along behind them.
Those are great traits to think about, I think, for everyone who's going to listen to this podcast, and sort of where do they fall on the spectrum of those things. So if I'm, have a sense of humor, then maybe I'm one step closer to moving forward. One of the questions that I ask all of my guests, and I've loved every answer, is about vulnerability. When do you feel most vulnerable in your work, and how do you manage that?
Well, every step of the way. Creativity is a very difficult place to put yourself. If you're taking something that you've basically pulled out of your own heart and then putting it up there for the whole world to see, that is incredibly terrifying. And you're basically saying, this is a thing that came from my deepest core. I invite you now to criticize it, because that's essentially what you do when you put a film up. This is terrifying. So when a film comes out, especially in the first 6 months or so, when people talk about it and write about it and have a lot to say about it, it's an absolutely, you feel like your skin has been taken off and you're just wide open for anything.
When we're talking to women about thought leadership, I share a similar example around if you're a thought leader, you're sharing something new that people likely have never heard of or never seen. And so it is going to be uncomfortable. And if you know that going into it, hopefully you can manage it a little better. But if everyone is agreeing with what you're saying and they're like, oh yeah, chances are, you're not saying anything new and you're not a thought leader. And so it does take discomfort to sort of create a new way of being. Absolutely. Well,
especially, frankly, as feminists, we're asking for something incredibly uncomfortable to happen, which is for everything to change. We're not asking for a different law on the books about how fast you can drive or something like that. We're asking the family to change. That's at the core of absolutely everything. We're asking people to change the way they relate to each other in their deepest, most intimate relationships. So discomfort is just going to have to be our constant companion.
Oh, thanks. So this is going to be my last question for you. We, as part of our She Roars Thought Leadership Program, our goal is to help develop 2020 women by the year 2020. So that's what we want to see. We want more women in the social change sector speaking out and using their insights and expertise to really, lead the charge. What do you want for 2020?
Well, I want a better president by so much I can't even see straight. And I want to see women step into leadership side by side with men, just as they have always had a right to be, So I want to see a huge jump in leadership in the Senate, the House, and in all the state legislatures. And I think we're just looking at the beginning of that. There's so many women have stepped forward and identified themselves as potential candidates. I've been working on this for a long time, and it's incredibly gratifying to see finally women putting themselves forward in huge numbers.
It is really exciting. And it's also surprising how things have shifted, where I feel like before the last year's election, there was a lot of waiting to be invited to these conversations. Yeah. And now there is an urgency and an impatience that is exciting and transformative. And so I definitely think that if we can say anything good has come out of this political climate, is that we understand that there's a responsibility for all of us to sort of move the needle forward in a positive way. Absolutely. Is there anything else you'd like to share?
No, not a thing. This has been great fun.
Well, I am so delighted to have you, and this conversation has been fantastic. I'm only saying I'm going to let you go now because I promised we would keep it to 30 minutes, but I have hundreds of other questions, but maybe we'll do a follow-up on a future season.
Another time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Abigail.
Thank you so much. Take care.
I'm just so incredibly hexed by the beautiful, soulful quotes that all of my guests have shared. And so, as I said earlier, Abigail's quote, "Stories are the language of the heart," is so true. Oftentimes when we're thinking about thought leadership, We're focusing squarely on insights and expertise and making sure that people really have the body of work that lends itself to becoming a thought leader. But I also think it's important to consider how storytelling can be weaved into that. In the nonprofit sector, we know how valuable stories are to endearing people to a cause. And so think about how you can combine stories with your insights to emotionally connect to your audience. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Abigail. Please tune in next week. Thank you.